We're thrilled to welcome Jonathan Thon, co-founder and CEO of STRM.BIO, to the show today. Thank you once again for joining us. Let's kick things off, John. Can you share a brief personal intro with us?
Yeah, I mean, my background's originally as an academic. I was a professor at Harvard for a number of years. Nearly a decade ago now, I stepped away from my job. So I resigned my faculty position at Harvard to start my first biotech company. Ran that company as its CEO and chief scientific officer for a number of years, up until about 2 years ago, actually, when I recruited my replacements and stepped away from Platelet to found STRM.
That's amazing. And before we just dive deep here, can you provide a brief intro to STRM for us?
Absolutely. I mean, gene therapy, which I know you guys are familiar with, but gene therapy is this idea that you can cure diseases as opposed to treating the symptoms, right? The bottleneck in gene therapy today isn't so much the gene therapies themselves. We have some really good ones. It's the ability to deliver those gene therapies in vivo. And specifically what STRM is doing is developing extracellular vesicles, specifically microvesicles, to deliver gene therapies in vivo.
That's amazing. And diving a bit deeper into that origin story. So kind of as you mentioned, STRM was founded in 2019 with the goal of developing extracellular vesicles to deliver gene therapies in vivo and directly into the patient. We at BIOS obviously love delivery, and we're so curious to dive in more. But before we dive in deeper into the science and your journey as a company, can you tell us more about the genesis of STRM? What was really the spark that started it all, made you leave and start this up?
The idea behind STRM actually predates my previous company by a number of years, but as you can imagine, probably better than most, 10 years ago was maybe too early to start a gene delivery company when we didn't really have gene therapies to deliver. But there was a window of opportunity now that I want to take advantage of. Maybe a better question is, why the field needs it now. And I really believe that we're in this, Intel moment, as I like to call it, right? We think about gene therapies, or the way we're developing gene therapies today, they're very expensive, right? They're being designed for very select indications, very select diseases, very small number of people are accessing them or can access them. These are very expensive use cases that we're developing against. And gene therapy doesn't look too dissimilar from what the computer looked like back in the day, where they were big and bulky, they were expensive, they were only serving very, very specific niche roles. No one could really access them. And then the issue there was an efficiency of delivering information. We're in the same boat here. What Intel did when they developed the first microprocessors was really find a way of delivering information more efficiently. And in so doing, we're able to bring the computer in-house, give everyone access to it, and really transform the industry, right? We're in that moment now, right? These gene therapies are expensive, no one has access to them, but if we can deliver these gene therapies more effectively, then we can make them a household thing. They can become viable therapeutic options for people. You can get them at the doctor's office. And if we can do that, we're going to transform the industry.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. And I think so much of the ecosystem has poured into the concept, obviously, of delivery and the serious issues that are currently facing it. Diving just a little bit deeper, Jonathan, I'd love to hear from your own words, continuing that thread. What are really some of those key unmet needs in the space right now?
Well, we've had some pretty meaningful successes, right? Editors, for one. We've got CRISPR, we've got base editors, prime editors, twin prime editors. We've also had some pretty meaningful early clinical proof points in humans, which I think are also very important. The bottlenecks today, though, as I mentioned, are really how we translate those wins into broader populations and more significant numbers of patients, and how we do that cheaper. And so really the limitations or the challenges that the field is facing today are threefold, I think. The first being one around delivery. We need to be a lot more specific, targeted in how we get these gene editors to the cells we're wanting to edit. not being able to do so or having broad distribution profiles is really driving a lot of the safety toxicity issues that we're facing. We need to address this inability to repeat dose. I mean, we talk a lot about one and done therapies in this field, but this is tail wagging dog, right? We're focusing on one and done therapies because we can't come in with a second dose. And not being able to come in with a second dose is really limiting the indications that we could go after or the approaches we take to go after some of those indications. Thirdly, I think we really need to think about how we scale manufacturing and more importantly, bring down the overall costs of manufacturing, because those costs are a major driver for why these gene therapies cost as much as they do. Where if we can bring the CMC or the COGS down by an order of magnitude, maybe 2 orders of magnitude, we suddenly create products that insurance companies can reimburse. And if insurance companies can reimburse, then suddenly they become things that become accessible to patients.
No, I mean 100%. And focusing that back on Storm now, looking at the ecosystem broadly now more to you all. Storm is overcoming many of these challenges through the use of extracellular vesicles. Can we just get a bit of context for our audience? So what are EVs and how do they address or overcome the traditional challenges of gene therapy delivery as you see it?
Well, Storm was specifically created to solve these challenges, right? This company exists at this point in time to serve that bridge into making gene therapies more accessible. The way we're doing that is through extracellular vesicles, and like I said, specifically microvesicles. What we're advantaged in, what's differentiating, is that these vesicles, first of all, have a very specific natural tropism that is driven by a complement of multiple proteins and membrane composition that sees them to the cells that we're wanting to target. The vesicles themselves are actually quite large as well, and that's important too because they have a pretty sizable carrying capacity, as big as the biggest viruses we have. We haven't actually hit an upper limit in terms of how much cargo we can put in or how big a cargo we can put in. But what I can say is we can get hundreds, even thousands of copies per vesicle, and this is meaningful because it lets us put in plasma DNA, put in RNA or RNP, so CRISPR-Cas9 systems, different modalities of gene therapy. We could also multiplex, which is really important if what we're wanting to do is go after more complex diseases as well that will require multiple editors to correct. And I think we also need to acknowledge that these next generation of gene editors, like prime or twin prime editors, are frankly getting larger, right? And they don't fit into the delivery vehicles of viruses that we have today. And so we do need larger carrying capacity to be able to hold. I think the third piece here, and the part that I'm most excited about, is that the platform itself is amenable to repeat dosing. You can come in with a single dose ex vivo if that's what you want to do, but you can also come in vivo, which is where the field needs to transition to, and dose once a week, once a month if that's what you want to do, which again really opens up the landscape, really opens up the playing field, and lets you be more creative about how we think about curing diseases. The second part of your question there was around how that's differentiated from exosomes, for example, and these are different products, right? Microvesicles bud off the parent cell surface, right? And because they bud off the parent cell surface, they'll share membrane composition, protein composition with the parent cell. Exosomes derive from multivesicular bodies inside of the cell, right? Vesicles inside of vesicles, which means just like lipid nanoparticles, just like viruses, they don't have any inherent tropism anywhere. You have to engineer that characteristic in, and that's not trivial. We've known that to be true over this last decade of trying to do it. You also, that size components, that the carrying capacity is also quite significant, right? Microvesicles, at least ours, have a pretty defined diameter of about 200 nanometers, quite big, right? Exosomes, by comparison, tend to range in the order of 50 to 100 nanometers in diameter, which really limits how much you can put into them, how big a cargo, how many copies. Certainly, like we said, they don't fit a lot of the things that we'd like them to deliver. And maybe a really important note here too, and this is shared by lipid nanoparticles as well, and even viruses, is that the tools and technologies that exist today to characterize particles, things like microscopes, nanoparticle analyzers, flow cytometers, they work really well at greater than 100 nanometer sizes. They were designed for cells. They'll work with microvesicles, which means we have a really good handle on what these products look like. These technologies, quite frankly, fall apart for sub-100 nanometer particles, which is one of the big challenges that companies in the exosome space have faced, right? It's why those technologies have really struggled to make it through regulatory and into the clinic. And then the last piece here is, the repeat dosing angle too. I mean, you can do this with microvesicles to some extent. You can do it with exosomes, depending on where the exosomes come from. Some of the big challenges that derive from lipid nanoparticles, again, very, very dependent on their chemistry and how they're synthesized. And viruses is the immune response that comes from, dosing it the first time and then trying to come in with a second dose, third dose, or the accumulation of synthetic products in organs or tissues where we don't really want it to be, which drives a lot of the safety profile or the negative safety profile that really hampers what it could be used for.
It's fantastic. I think it's a phenomenal overview, again, how STORM fits into the space and looking at exosomes and LNPs. I mean, it's just a really great top-down approach. And now, just for the sake of builders, of course, I would love to just cycle this back into STORM, right? And just with that understanding of the space overall, can you describe STORM's approach to solving these radical issues in gene therapy delivery?
Well, the STORM's approach is really focused initially on the platform itself, right? These microvesicles that have an inherent tropism to cells we're wanting to target, their unique size, which lets us put all the editing tools we want to put into them, lets us get creative and multiplex where we want to go after more complex things. And by virtue of having ability to repeat dose on the table, sure, we can develop therapeutics that are one and done, curative treatments, but we can also develop therapeutics that maybe we could lean into a repeat dosing approach. And maybe that approach, that solution is a more viable or better therapeutic option for the patient than trying to come in and correct the mutation outright. So what STORM is doing is really building a platform that enables this next generation of gene therapies. Now, within STORM, we've also got gene therapy programs of our own. And there, where we've been focusing historically, has been in the rare blood disease space, and mostly blood diseases because it's an area that I've got a tremendous amount of experience in. I come from a hematology background, but also through my experience, have come to see as an area of huge clinical unmet need, mostly because of the difficulties in delivering treatments to bone marrow cells, hematopoietic stem cells, where a lot of these diseases originate.
That's amazing, Jonathan. And just kind of continuing down this thread of how STORM is continuing to approach this, can you expand on the potential of this technology and as the platform just grows, how this will change the industry overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think we think a lot about what the world looks like if we're successful. And quite frankly, I mean, what we're trying to do with STORM is shift the paradigm to a place where we're democratizing gene therapy, right? Where we're making gene therapies accessible and affordable. That gene therapies today for very specific diseases where they're available cost $3 million a treatment. It's crazy because it's not clear how insurance companies are going to reimburse, if they can reimburse at all. But even if they could, even if we figure out or are figuring out payment plans in order to support those therapies, they're not accessible to everyone. They're accessible to very few people who can afford to do them, right? That's not where the field needs to be going. That's really not the future that I think we're all envisioning when we think gene therapy. What we're wanting to do is bring this as a treatment option for everyone, right? And we do that initially by giving but we're creating platforms that are just more flexible and let us go after more things in more creative ways. And quite frankly, platforms that are cheaper. If we can bring the cost down to hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, suddenly insurance can reimburse, and suddenly, people can access. And so it becomes a solution that everyone gets to play a role in, right? As we do that, and again, I'm going to call on the Intel moment here, because I think the parallels are dramatic. We don't just create a solution in rare diseases. We don't create just a solution in healthcare, but we begin transitioning the technology, gene editing, into areas like agriculture, into cosmetics, into information technology, right? And that's necessarily where these technologies need to go. These need to be a tool that everyone can access for all of the problems that we're wanting to direct them to. And in order for that to happen, we need to be able to deliver this information more effectively.
A lot of problems to be solved out there. I think delivery as a beginning is phenomenal, especially just through the lens through what STORM is coming from, through creating more equitable medicine, something previous people we've hosted have been very opinionated on. I know it's something that BIOS we hold very dearly and love promoting. And as you've mentioned, you've obviously thought about this, and you constantly iterate on this with you and your own employees about kind of the future of gene therapy and how delivery fits into that key unmet need. I'd love to just take that even a step deeper as well from a medical perspective. When you're looking at delivery, what do you think? What will redosing and reduced immunogenicity do or enable within our own current healthcare system?
What it's going to let us do is really, firstly, go after more diseases, more complex problems that we're just not able to access today, because, quite frankly, the number of diseases that can be cured with a single dose are a small sliver of the diseases that are out there that we would like to treat. And the diseases that practically can be cured with a single dose are a smaller sliver of that still, right? So we're really focusing a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of money into a very small fraction of curative technologies, where what we would like to be able to do is, be a whole lot more broad access and help solve health problems for a greater number of patients. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect, which we also touched on, is this ability to be more creative in the solutions that we're employing. If we're limited to curative treatments, and that will work well for something, we're just never going to touch, we're never going to go after. There are some cases, examples where you might want wild-type protein expression, where a better way of achieving that is through a repeat dosing regimen, where you're delivering a plasmid DNA and having it translate protein on a once a month or once every few months basis, as opposed to trying to go in there and edit the genome, right? Because there are, inevitably safety concerns that follow, right? So all I'm not saying is one treatment is necessarily better than the other, but I think what we need to be able to create for ourselves is optionality, and be able to advance those options that present the better therapeutic treatment for the patients, not limit ourselves to the options that we currently have access to, because we really haven't invested in better technologies.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And sticking on that vein, like as you described with STORM, you're really rewriting the playbook on gene therapy through the use of EVs. But in the past, historically, EVs have faced challenges of their own, primarily surrounding isolation and scale-up manufacturing, and really just drug loading as well. How is STORM addressing a lot of these pre-existing EV challenges, and how are you really thinking about it?
Well, it's worth noting that the EV challenges are really exosome challenges, right? The challenges that we faced around, the field, I should say, has faced around characterizing exosomes has resulted a lot from the fact that these are sub 100 nanometer particles, for which the tools and technologies that we have accessible to us today, flow cytometers, microscopes, nanoparticle analyzers, fall apart at, right? They don't work. And because they don't work, or don't work well enough, we really don't have an idea of what the product is that we're making, how pure it is. We require that information in order to be able to answer questions around characterization, concentration, purity. And these are all very important questions that factor into second order challenges around scalability, definition, quality control and release, and safety, which ultimately are gatekeeping items for clinical advancements, right? So characterization is a really big deal. Another big deal has been the challenge around driving tropism for a lot of these particles, right? Exosomes, by virtue of deriving from multivesicular bodies, vesicles inside of vesicles, they're not born with any clear targeting or natural targeting to any cells or tissues of interest, right? In that regard, they're very much like lipid nanoparticles, like viruses. We have to engineer that characteristic in. The other consideration when you're thinking about exosomes is that they're deriving from multivesicular bodies, right? So vesicles inside of vesicles. And in that regard, they're not so dissimilar from lipid nanoparticles or from viruses, in that they don't have any inherent targeting, any inherent tropism. Right? You have to engineer that characteristic in. And as we've spoken about, that's not trivial. Right? At best, you can get maybe 1, 2 receptors on the surface. And we've known from work over the last decade that that's just not enough, right? And so you're challenged around still delivering these gene editors to the place where they need to go. Whereas microvesicles, especially dependent on the parent cell that they're deriving, will inherit more than a dozen different proteins, which drive a very specific tropism. It's really the way the body works, right? It's up until now, we've been thinking about this as lock and key. The way the body interacts with cells, the way cells interact with delivery vehicles, is really more of a secret handshake, right? It's a number of different receptors, each one of them which combines with the others to grant that specificity. And we're missing that in the current generation of vesicles. Exosomes are small, right? And the fact that they're small means you're limited in how much cargo you can put into it, the complexity of those cargo. And certainly it leaves out the ability to put in some of these next-gen gene editors or get more complex and begin multiplexing within them, which is ultimately what we're going to need to correct some of these more complex disorders where you need multiple editors doing multiple things in order to fix the disease. So I think the combination of all of these things have ultimately contributed to where exosomes have fallen short, right? What's ironic in this whole thing is that microvesicles as a delivery vehicle actually predates our understanding of exosomes by quite a while. But historically, we have been focused very much on cells. And then when we began studying intercell communication is around the time exosomes were first discovered. And so a lot of attention was put into exosomes. But it's through microvesicles and specifically in some systems exclusively through microvesicles where cells communicate with one another. And certainly what we're doing at STORM is trying to leverage a lot of that innate biology to create more efficient delivery vehicles for the cargo that we're intending to transmit.
Right. And building off this in a slightly different manner, going on a separate thread here. As we're looking at the company as a whole, there were two things I was really fascinated about with Storm. When you launched in 2019, you launched with a hybrid virtual operating model, even ahead of the pandemic, and at the start, just a work from home model. I'd just be really curious from a function standpoint and just organizational structure. What led to your launch with a hybrid model?
It's a good question. Our hybrid model was born out of a response to investor sentiment. Now, mind you, 3 years ago, that one needed to build infrastructure from the earliest. And that didn't really make a lot of sense to me because early on, there doesn't seem to be a lot of need, or at least I didn't think there was a lot of need to be recreating the wheel, right? Recreating infrastructure that already existed elsewhere. Mostly because creating infrastructure is expensive, it takes time, And a lot of times what you're trying to do is recreate infrastructure that is already evolved, developed over a long period of time to become very efficient in the site where that infrastructure exists. And so I felt pretty strongly, actually, that at its outset, a biotech company should, instead of trying to recreate the wheel, build its own infrastructure from the go, lean heavily on existing infrastructure, through collaborations, through CDMO contracts, through personal network and connections in order to just move faster. And I will say that the nuance of the argument I was making felt overlooked at the time, and quite frankly was not a winning argument when I was trying to raise money at the outset when we had founded the company. Now, I think timing here, as in most things, is everything. And about 2 months post founding Storm on a hybrid virtual operating model, we hit COVID, and suddenly this idea that you can leverage existing infrastructure became a lot more attractive. And so interest that quite frankly didn't exist from investors prior to COVID came 180. And there was a lot of people that were very interested in how this model works and how early stage companies especially could leverage that to be able to get anything done at all, at a time and place when people really weren't going into work and no one was interested in building something new from scratch, a new infrastructure from scratch. Now, in that regard, I think we had a huge competitive edge because the company was built from the ground up to be a hybrid virtual company. And what it allowed us to do over the first couple of years is really move a lot faster than we would have been able to do under normal circumstances if we were trying to build infrastructure from scratch. Certainly within COVID, moved so much faster still because it let us leverage those capabilities that were ongoing and we weren't slowed down in the least. So what came out of it is really a validation that the idea works and makes a lot of sense for an early stage company. Now, the point I was trying to make with Storm and with our hybrid virtual operating model isn't an absolutist one, right? Companies do require infrastructure, but they require infrastructure where they are strongest and where they need to retain control and be able to develop within their core competencies. And so as companies develop, as companies grow, as they understand what their core competencies are, that infrastructure starts being built up and in, so you become less reliant on outside parties to do the things that you are now powered to do really, really well and faster really than your collaborators. And that's what we have done. But there are other areas where you recognize that the work that you're doing in that space is going to be for a very short period of time, right? If you're running animal studies, you don't need to set up a vivarium and you don't need to create a whole level of expertise in animal models and animal injection studies or histology capabilities when the study itself is going to be a 2-month, 3-month exercise, and then you're going to move on, right? And so in areas like that, or in areas where they aren't core competencies of the company, but there are existing facilities, existing collaborators, existing infrastructure where those capabilities are already running and running very efficiently and effectively, it continues to make a lot of sense for companies to leverage that and continue to leverage that. And to the point here is that that's where the hybrid virtual comes in. Sometimes those capabilities are physically in your laboratory space, and sometimes they're not. And a company should be able to access both.
Sure, and I love the dynamic approach to this and how, I mean, even just looking at it prior to 2019, it's fascinating to see how that's evolved and almost use it as, like yourself, Storm, has used it as a case study as, hey, this model works. So that's wildly fascinating. The second thing I want to touch on that I was just super passionate about and ties back a bit into BIOS, right? In addition to your work scaling the technology and company everything with Storm, you've written also a number of phenomenal thought leadership pieces on how to operationalize, scale up startups, and just plenty of other opinion pieces from your own words as a CEO and founder yourself. How do you think about the role of CEO evangelism and branding as part of a company's development?
It's an interesting question because I feel pretty strongly that the CEO plays an important role in setting the vision, right? Their role is to chart the path. And that really only happens through communication, right? When we think about branding, branding is really setting the tone for that communication. You're creating the culture. You're defining expectations. I would like to be able to take credit for these insights, but these insights actually don't come from me, or rather, I should say, a lot of this insight comes from a conversation I had with my dad. I want to say 3-4 years ago. It was, it was a moment in time where I was under a lot of pressure. I was very stressed out, and I remember coming home and talking to my dad about it, and feeling and communicating to him that I felt I was carrying the weight of the company, right? The weight of my employees, the weight of their expectations, the weight of the board's expectations. And my dad made it very clear to me that I was not, right? My role wasn't to carry these employees, to carry these board members, to carry our investors. That's not what I was meant to do. My role was to be the tip of the spear, right? The CEO is the one that's driving the ship. They're seeing the future that can be. They're charting a path toward it, and you're creating a wake. And in that wake, others can follow, right? So you actually do need to be weightless, right? You're not carrying. You're charting a path. And when you think about what you're calling CEO evangelism or branding, what I see that as being is really communicating effectively the direction that you're taking the company, the vision that you have, and creating space for others to be able to follow suit and help carry you, help propel you to that future that you see for everyone.
Yeah, I completely agree, and love the insights and honestly the motivation, digging deeper to why you started developing thought leadership. And I think there's a lot to derive from that. I really appreciate kind of the behind the scenes look on that. Continuing on to more down the storm route, wanted to focus in on a bit of a topic of just major challenges and accomplishments. So when we're looking at shifting topics slightly to challenges and accomplishments on your journey, more recently, you said we've significantly outperformed this year against some very ambitious targets, and we're moving into 2022 ahead of schedule. Would love to have this be an opportunity just to have you tell us a bit more. Where is Storm today?
Well, we did. We did over deliver, and we're able to, as a result, accelerate our timeline to about 6 months, which is, it's no joke. We were able to do quite a bit. At this point, we're in the place where we're having conversations with partners around how we can leverage our platform to help partners deliver their gene therapy assets more effectively, or translate their programs in vivo. That's really born out of the recognition, the realization that the platform that we've developed is a lot bigger than what we could conceivably go after, or our bandwidth to go after in our lifetime. And there are things, of course, that the company is interested in. And for those internal programs, we're now moving into bigger animal safety studies on step to first-in-human clinical validation. But there's a lot more that the platform could be directed to as well. And so we want to make sure that we're leveraging that platform to enable others to develop and deliver their gene therapy assets more effectively as well.
No, of course. I love the kind of current placement here. And I think Storm has just been pioneering an exciting approach to EV gene therapy and delivery. And just as you described, you've achieved a bunch of major milestones to date. I think kind of now taking a look backwards, what have been some of the greatest challenges that you and the team have faced building Storm?
The greatest challenge, and I'd be shocked if it was just Storm, but the greatest challenge that we've faced has been in recruitment. And it's been in recruitment because we set the bar very high in terms of the talent that we bring into Storm. And the fallout from that is that, at least through this last year, it created delays in hiring, mostly because I was unwilling to compromise on where we were setting the bar. Now, in complement to my team, the team really carried the weight of the company through the year and really stepped up and filled those gaps where they were missing, which in turn allowed us to, take our time and really hire the best into the company. And we have that. And I think in retrospect now, seeing the talent that we've recruited around the table, seeing how they're performing as a result and how they're communicating with each other, clearly the right decision. But these sorts of decisions don't come without difficulty. And again, recruitment, I think, is always probably the biggest challenge most companies face, especially in competitive environments like Boston, where you're competing with very large brand name companies around similar skill sets in cell and gene therapy.
Talent for sure is the name of the game. I guarantee you're not the only company dealing with the issues, but it's been amazing to see how Storm's been able to kind of evolve and go down that route of just hiring great talent. We'd love to ask more questions about that later. But more thinking on the business model, I'd love to dive in and take another jump into Storm here. So as we really think about platform companies today, we're seeing arguably as much innovation on the business side as on the science side of life sciences. Can you share how Storm thinks about go-to-market strategy?
We're first and foremost a gene therapy company, right? We're developing our own gene therapy programs and advancing those programs in areas where we see huge clinical unmet need. Like I shared, my background initially has been in hematology, and by virtue of my experiences in hematology, I've really seen how important it is to create solutions and clinical treatments for diseases that historically have been difficult to target because they're born out of hematopoietic stem cells in a bone marrow, which is a very difficult area to access. The implications of creating cures, huge, right? And that's been driving a lot of the passion and a lot of the first generation pipeline programs for Storm. Now within the gene therapy programs that we're developing, the company has established a pretty robust and pretty exciting gene delivery platform, right? And as we think about how we leverage that platform, certainly in using it to deliver our gene therapies more effectively in vivo and change the paradigm of gene therapy toward in vivo treatments that is cheaper, more efficacious, better dosing regimens, less toxicity, more safe. But we also think a lot about how we can enable the rest of the field to do that as well, right? We got into it. I certainly got into this to make a difference in people's lives and to help cure a lot of diseases. And quite frankly, there are diseases for which there are phenomenal gene therapies out there today that have a delivery challenge that we're not going to be able to, or nor should we be developing competitive technologies to try to cure when those technologies exist. But what we can be doing is making a platform available to others to help deliver their gene therapy assets. One thing that I think that requires, which is maybe difficult, is absolutely difficult, is the requirement to check one's ego at the door and recognize that these are complex challenges that really require a combination of a delivery platform, a gene therapy asset, and a group to drive the program clinically and commercially as well. And we would all like to believe that we are all three of those things, or all four of those things. But quite frankly, in reality, there are areas where we are strongest and there are areas where we are weakest. And we really do the patient a disservice if we try to do it all when we could be partnering or we could be combining our strengths with the strengths of others to see some of these programs through. And so, when we think about partnerships, what we're really talking about is how we combine the best possible combinations of technologies and approaches to really do the patient a service and try to get the best possible treatments to patients as quickly as we can. Right now, in some cases, what we've got is the desirable gene therapy assets and we've got the desirable gene delivery vehicle. In those instances, yes, we maybe are the best possible group to advance them clinically, maybe advance them commercially. But there are a lot of other indications, a lot of other cases where we may have the stronger delivery platform, but we don't have any gene therapy asset in that space, nor are we ever intending to create one. And there is partner with that asset already in hand. And so instead of conceiving how we enter a space that we're, quite frankly, we shouldn't be playing in, I think a better use of our time is thinking creatively about how we can put that platform in that partner's hand so that they can bring their gene therapy solution to the market.
Yeah, yeah. And like after focusing on kind of the current business strategy and your approach to date, I'd love to start now looking towards and just projecting towards the future. What's coming next for Storm?
Well, we did sort of touch upon this a little bit at the beginning, but I really do think, and the company is really focused on thinking how we can create the future that we envision for the space of cell and gene therapy, right? We've talked about this Intel moment where the field has got to transition away from select diseases, small numbers of patients, expensive use cases, into bigger numbers of patients, broader use cases, and really bring down the overall cost of treatments from $3 million a treatment to something closer to like tens of thousands or $100,000 treatments, where insurance companies can reimburse, patients can access. We could really democratize gene therapy and make them viable therapeutic options for people. I think if we can do that, and we're laser focused on creating that future, I think if we can do that, what we're creating is this future where we can begin extending the breadth of what gene therapy is used for beyond certainly rare diseases, but even beyond healthcare as well, towards industries like agriculture, cosmetics, information technology, others. Right? I mean, if we do think back, we have been engineering DNA, RNA for decades, right? We know the technology works, right? The issue is not with the technology or the promise of that technology, because from it have stemmed all sorts of interesting, phenomenal animal models, all sorts of creative, different proteins and functional effects, enzymes, colors. There's been applications of gene therapy and art. The limitation hasn't been with the technology itself, right? The technology is wondrous, and we've been reaping the benefits of that wonder for decades. The challenge here is how we share that beyond the limitations of a lab bench, or beyond the clinical limitations of a single patient or a rare blood disease, to a broader audience, to humanity as a whole.
And I think building on top of that, we've been able to have a lot of phenomenal conversations in just this hour alone about the current limitations in gene therapy. And I think what we want to really look towards in the future, and just your own opinion, building Storm, thinking about it from a patient impact perspective and looking at the future, with the adoption of Storm's platform and the scale up of EV manufacturing, we'll hopefully see the cost barriers changing for gene therapy. For you as an innovator in the space, when do you see this tipping point happening, and what do you think Storm's involvement will be with that tipping point?
I'll give you an answer. I don't know if it's the answer that you're looking for, but an academic mentor of mine, now more than a decade ago, once drew it out for me very clearly. He said to me that there are 3 stages of discovery, right? There's the first stage where everyone doubts that what you're working on is a problem and no one knows who you are. There's the second stage where everyone recognizes that this is an issue, right? This problem is real, but no one believes that you'll be the one to solve it. And the third stage is that everyone takes for granted the solution, right? They forgot that there was a problem to begin with, and no one remembers that you had anything to do with it. It feels like a pretty, I guess, challenged view of how the world works. But I think it also requires one to really check their ego at the door and recognize that what we're building is a piece of a larger whole, right? We're in a continuity of human development and progress. And where I'm focused, where Storm is focused, and really where we should be focused, if we're building companies at this stage, are transitioning us from stage 2, which is where a lot of these companies are, into stage 3, which is where these become, technologies that are taken for granted that no one really puts too much thought into, because the problems, if they were problems at all, and we forget about that, are now, existing, applicable, democratized solutions. And that's really, I think, what I imagine 2050 and beyond to look like.
I love that, and I think I really appreciate your insight as far as segmenting the different stages of what this is really going to look like. I think that's fascinating. Continuing on that thread, as you mentioned, 2050, would love to keep having you peer into the little crystal ball here. As we're imagining it's 2050, can you describe the broader field of gene therapies? What challenges have we addressed? Maybe what diseases have we treated, and where are we going afterwards?
I mean, without getting into specifics, because quite frankly, I can't see the future any better than anyone else can. I do see us in parallels with the way the computer went, in that we are going, gene therapy is now solving these final hurdles, and with so doing, will allow a tool that, quite frankly, we know works to become a whole lot more accessible. And with that accessibility, open up the breadth of what we're doing with it, both in terms of healthcare, where we're extending it to a lot more diseases and more practical diseases that people have, as opposed to rare diseases where you're struggling to find 10, maybe 15 patients in the whole world. And also beginning to explore the applications of gene editing in neighboring industries where we haven't conventionally thought of them as viable tools or interesting tools to employ, but really haven't thought of them not because the technology wouldn't be applicable to it, but because of these cost thresholds that have limited us from ever considering, gene information storage challenge, where we're competing with a single solid state drive at pennies on the dollar, right? As long as those cost differences exist, you're never going to apply one to the other. But as we begin leaning into this technology, as we begin improving it, as we get better at delivery, like the computer, right? They get progressively smaller. More people start having access to them. They winnow their way down to the point where you've got a crazy computer built into your phone, even your watch, right? And once you get things that small and that effective and that affordable, suddenly you're employing them for all sorts of different things. And they themselves aren't the solution anymore. What they are is the platform. Gene editing is the platform upon which you can then build next-gen technologies and innovate the solutions of the future. And so, if I think back to your initial question, which is, where is Storm in 2050? I'm hopeful that we're still innovating. But what I'd love us to be doing is actively investing in these next generation of entrepreneurs and next generation of ideas that are now using gene delivery and gene editing as a platform to do more creative things that we can't conceive of today, because we don't have the availability of technology to let us do them.
Of course, I love the continuation and predictions of the future. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Just a few questions, rapid fire, before we close things up here.
Shoot.
Would you have any advice to share with current graduate students or professors who are interested in starting a company?
Lean in and do it. I mean, this is the best job I've ever had. That I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, but the how one enters entrepreneurship is because, as most scientists do, you have a number of ideas. A subset of those are relatively good ideas, and a handful of those need to exist in the world. No one sees them but you. And quite frankly, if you don't advance them, they may never exist. And so, yes, it's a difficult job. Yes, it's challenging. Yes, uphill the whole way. But the value of doing it is that you get to create a future that otherwise may never have existed. And so, lean in, do it.
100%. I love the sentiment. If not now, when? If not me, then who? I think that sentiment has covered a lot of entrepreneurs in the past and is just carries a lot of weight. So I appreciate the insight, Jonathan. Any other closing thoughts or shameless plugs you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, I'll say we're always raising money. We're always recruiting exceptional talents. I personally care very deeply about professional development, especially for early career scientists. And I'm always accessible. So anyone who's seeing this should always feel very welcome to reach out to me.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jonathan, again, for an absolutely fantastic episode. We're very grateful for your time. Just thanks again.
Thank you, Drew.